The winds over the Sahel are changing again. They no longer whisper submission, nor carry the scent of dependency. They rise now with intent, heavy with the dust of defiance and the fragrance of faith. And in the heart of that restless wind stands a young soldier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He does not speak in the polished tones of diplomacy. He speaks in the language of survival, the raw, unwavering voice of a man who believes that freedom is not a gift, but a discipline. To him, sovereignty is sacred work, earned each dawn, guarded with every heartbeat. And that belief, my brothers and sisters, is shaking boardrooms far beyond the red earth of Burkina Faso. Because this is more than Burkina Faso news. It is a signal, a call, an awakening. So stay with us till the end, and make sure you subscribe, because what is rising in the Sahel tonight is not just a story, it is a sign. A reminder that even in the driest lands, freedom can still bloom again. Burkina Faso, the year 2022. The sun burned over a weary land, a land that had buried too many sons and daughters beneath its dust. For years, the people had prayed for peace, but peace never came. They had voted, waited, trusted, and been betrayed. The markets of Ouagadougou whispered the same lament. Different faces, same hunger. Different leaders, same chains. In the north, villages vanished overnight, erased by raids and terror. In the capital, politicians spoke of progress while fear stalked every road. The world watched, but from a distance, through headlines and half-truths. To them, Burkina Faso was a statistic, another line in the long ledger of African despair. Then, one morning, under a pale sky heavy with dust, the wind shifted. A convoy rolled into the capital, not with fanfare, but with finality. At its head was a young man, barely 40, eyes calm as steel. He was no general of privilege, no heir to power. He was a captain, a soldier of the people, not of politics. His name? Ibrahim Traoré. When he spoke for the first time as leader, his voice was low, measured, and filled with something the nation had forgotten: conviction. "We are not fighting terrorism," he said. "We are fighting a system, one built to keep Africa weak." Those words cracked the air like thunder after drought. Because deep down, everyone knew he was right. The battle was never just against bullets. It was against dependence, the invisible leash that had held nations for generations. In the marketplaces, women stopped to listen. In the army barracks, soldiers nodded silently. And in the homes where candles burned beside portraits of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, old men whispered, "Perhaps the flame has returned." For the first time in decades, hope did not feel naive. It felt earned. Traoré began to move quickly, dissolving military agreements that tied the nation's security to foreign hands, reviewing contracts that sold its gold and land to outsiders. He replaced imported aid with local initiative, telling his ministers, "A nation that cannot feed itself cannot call itself free." In those early months, Burkina Faso began to breathe again. Farmers spoke of dignity. Students painted slogans of pride. The youth marched, not in protest, but in belief. But beyond its borders, unease grew. In conference rooms far from the Sahel's heat, analysts murmured, "Who is this young soldier? What will he cost us? What if his defiance spreads?" Because every empire fears the same thing, not rebellion, but example. When one nation stands, others remember how. And as the winds of the Sahel turned, you could feel it, something ancient waking beneath the dust. It was not just a change of power, it was a change of spirit. Burkina Faso, once spoken of in pity, now spoke in purpose. Elders said it felt like Sankara's echo, but heavier, more guarded, forged from lessons written in blood. Traoré carried that weight like a man walking through storm, aware that every step forward stirred forces that preferred him silent. Yet he did not bend. He wore no arrogance, only urgency. and in his eyes the people saw not a politician, but a mirror reflecting their own hunger for dignity. For in the Sahel, people understand this truth better than most. Freedom is not an inheritance. It is a rhythm, and when you stop moving to its beat, it fades. That year, under a sky red with dust, Burkina Faso began to move again. One heartbeat, one field, one soldier, one mother at a time. The flag did not change, but the spirit beneath it did. And from Lagos to Dakar, from Harlem to Johannesburg, people began to whisper the same name with cautious pride: Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Because for the first time in a long time, Africa was not just reacting to history, it was making it. But the world doesn't surrender its grip easily, and as the young captain rose, unseen hands began to tighten their hold. The storm that came next did not march in boots. It crept in silence, through screens, through whispers, through headlines dressed as truth. This was not the war of our fathers. No rifles at dawn, no flags raised in the smoke. This was a new kind of invasion, one made of pixels and persuasion, of money moved in shadows and voices borrowed by machines. They called it hybrid destabilization. It had no face, no border, no uniform. It moved like fog, unseen until it was everywhere. At first, the signs seemed scattered, a convoy ambushed in the north, no one claiming credit. Then a radio station in Bobo Dioulasso began to preach discontent, quoting phrases lifted word for word from policy memos written thousands of miles away. Next came the explosions, small, precise, too well-timed to be random. Traoré watched the pattern unfold. He saw the same playbook that had strangled other revolutions: light small fires, feed them rumors, then offer help once the house begins to burn. And so, he acted. He declared defensive state protocol, level amber. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso sealed its skies. Roads were lined with checkpoints. The government's digital networks were fortified. Paranoia? The Western press asked. Preparation, the captain replied. He understood what the cameras did not, that a revolution can be killed not with bullets, but with disbelief. Once you make the people doubt themselves, you no longer need to invade their land. To fight that, he built something new: the Fortress Doctrine. It began not with weapons, but with words. Every night, state radio aired sovereignty briefings, plain, slow, and honest. Officials spoke directly to the people, explaining what was happening and why. Farmers in Kaya listened beneath stars. Students in Ouagadougou took notes by candlelight. For the first time, the nation's voice did not come through a foreign tongue. Vigilance, the broadcast said, is not fear, it is love defended. And the people listened. But abroad, outrage grew louder. Editors in Paris and London called it censorship. Washington think tanks warned of authoritarian drift. They wrote as if a nation defending its own mind was somehow an act of aggression. In the presidential compound, debates stretched through sleepless nights. Some advisors urged restraint. You cannot build democracy on fear. Others whispered back, you cannot build it on invasion either. And in the quiet between those arguments, Traoré stood at the window, watching the lights of Ouagadougou flicker like a nervous heartbeat. He knew what history demanded of men like him, and what it had done to those before him: Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Muammar Gaddafi. Each dreamed of Africa standing tall, and each was buried beneath the weight of interference disguised as friendship. Traoré knew their ghosts by name. He had studied their courage and their caution. He had learned the pattern of betrayal, and he had sworn not to repeat it. We are not building walls, he told his ministers. We are building shields. But every shield casts a shadow, and in that shadow, suspicion began to grow. A journalist wondered aloud if criticism was still safe. An NGO director hesitated before posting a report. Even in ordinary homes, people spoke lower when politics entered the room. The line between protection and paranoia grew thinner with every broadcast. The revolution that had started as a song was slowly learning to speak in whispers. Outside, the world shook its head. Inside, the people stood a little taller, because for the first time, they felt the state was fighting for them, not against them. A farmer told a reporter, "Maybe freedom needs a guard sometimes. Maybe this is what rebuilding feels like." And yet, somewhere deep in the captain's heart, another voice spoke, a quieter, older one. "Remember, young man, even the walls built to protect can one day become the walls that confine." And so, as Burkina Faso learned to defend its body, another battle began, for the soul that lived inside. The fortress was built not of stone, but of discipline. It stood in the hearts of men, in the vigilance of mothers, in the quiet watchfulness of every street corner. Burkina Faso had entered a new season, the season of order. The Fortress Doctrine was no longer just policy, it was pulse. Every ministry, every school, every radio frequency now marched to the rhythm of survival. "Vigilance is survival," the posters read. "Loyalty is protection," the radios echoed. For the first time in years, trucks could travel from Kaya to Wahiguya without fear. Children returned to classrooms that had been silent for months. Markets opened at dawn and closed under streetlights that worked again. People spoke of safety the way they once spoke of rain, as a blessing too long denied. Yet in the hush that followed this newfound calm, another truth began to whisper. Safety can comfort, but it can also command. Journalists wondered how far the walls would rise. Community leaders asked how long the checkpoints would stand. And in the narrow streets of Ouagadougou, the question passed quietly from mouth to mouth. When does protection become possession? Inside the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat late into the night, the hum of air conditioners mixing with the distant cries of crickets. On his desk lay 3 photographs: Sankara, Lumumba, Gaddafi. Beneath them, a handwritten note in his own script. "Independence is not a day, it is a discipline." He had repeated that line so often that even his aides could recite it by heart. It was his creed, and his burden. Reports came daily. Cyber intrusions blocked, funding trails traced, infiltrations uncovered. The fortress was holding. But each layer of protection demanded another layer of control. Radio hosts learned to pause before they spoke. Activists learned to measure their tone. Even celebration began to sound rehearsed, as if joy itself needed permission. One morning, an old teacher from Bobo Dioulasso wrote an open letter. She praised the president's courage, but warned, "A fortress is safest when its gates can open. A people too guarded will forget how to dream." The letter circulated briefly before disappearing from the airwaves. No one knew who ordered its removal. Some said it was an algorithm, others an official. But in the silence that followed, you could almost hear a nation holding its breath. And yet, outside the capital, life was better. Roads that had been death traps now carried grain and laughter. The northern towns, once emptied by fear, began to fill again. Villagers said, "Maybe this is what freedom feels like, to sleep without fear." The truth was layered, as truth often is. The fortress had brought peace, yes, but also stillness. Progress, yes, but also pressure. And perhaps that was inevitable. For every revolution, when tested by time, must choose between speed and safety, between openness and endurance. Traoré knew this. He once told a confidant, "History does not forgive those who sleep through danger, but it also does not forgive those who forget why they stayed awake." In those words lived the paradox of his rule, a leader trying to protect freedom so fiercely that he risked caging it. Meanwhile, the world kept its distance. Investments slowed, sanctions whispered in diplomatic corridors. But the people, they still believed. They called their leader Le Gardien de la Nation, the guardian of the nation. And in the marketplaces they said, better a watchful father than an absent one. Still, the question lingered like a shadow across the red horizon. Could vigilance live forever without turning into fear? One evening, as dusk swallowed the capital, Traoré stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Below him, the hum of generators, the chatter of life returning. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for victory, but for balance. Because deep down, he knew, walls can keep danger out, but they can also keep truth from coming in. And as the fortress grew stronger, the world began to tremble, for the winds of the Sahel were spreading beyond its borders. Beyond the red horizon of Burkina Faso, the world was watching, not with admiration, but with unease. Because the winds of the Sahel had begun to move beyond borders, carrying with them the dust of defiance and the scent of something new, a different kind of freedom. In Washington, analysts called it authoritarian contagion. In Brussels, they named it a security risk. In Paris, it was something else, fear disguised as policy. For the first time in generations, the old powers looked south and realized the mirror had cracked. Across Africa, young officers and restless citizens were whispering the same phrase: "If one stands, others will rise." And at the center of that whisper stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not as a conqueror, but as a question the world had long avoided. What happens when Africa stops asking for permission? In Bamako, Mali, soldiers pledged solidarity. In Niamey, Niger, people painted his face beside that of Thomas Sankara. In Chad, in Sudan, in even the crowded streets of Lagos, the talk was the same. Sovereignty is back in style. From Moscow came couriers of cooperation, drones, data, and diplomacy. From Beijing, proposals for solar grids and satellite networks built without Western loans. From Brasilia, the offer of agricultural exchange, clean and unpolitical. And yet, through all this movement, the captain's voice remained calm. Sovereignty is contagious. If one nation stands, others will find the courage to rise. Those words traveled further than any bullet, further than any treaty. They found their way into classrooms, into sermons, into the songs of street performers. Because more than a political message, it was a spiritual one, a reminder that dignity could still be a destiny. But alliances built on resistance are fragile things. They glow with passion, but they burn through trust. And as the Sahelian nations began to link arms, the old world began to tighten its economic noose. Sanctions, suspensions, diplomatic freezes. Still, the flame would not go out. For once, Africa was not asking to be saved. It was choosing to stand, even if that meant standing alone. The Western editorials called it regression. The African youth called it resurrection. And somewhere between those two words, between regression and resurrection, the future of a continent began to take shape. But unity, like freedom, is fragile, and the question waiting beyond the applause was simple. Can the fortress endure the fire? By the dawn of 2025, the fortress stood tall. Checkpoints gleamed under the sun. The streets of Ouagadougou were calm, almost too calm. The revolution had survived its storms, but survival, my friends, is not the same as peace. Everywhere you looked, discipline had become the new devotion. The soldiers were sharper, the ministries were cleaner, the voices were quieter. And in that silence, something fragile began to stir. A question. Was this what freedom looked like? Or had vigilance, in its noble zeal, become the nation's new master? Inside the presidential compound, Captain Ibrahim Traoré moved through halls that no longer echoed. He read reports by lamplight, ambushes foiled, spies caught, networks dismantled. Burkina Faso had become a fortress in truth, strong enough to repel almost any blow. And yet, when he looked out the window at the sleeping city, the captain felt the unease that only great builders know. "We have built walls high enough to stop the enemy," he murmured, but how do we keep those same walls from closing in? He had done what history demanded, protected his people, reclaimed their dignity. But even righteous vigilance, left unchecked, can harden into habit. Loyalty, once sacred, can become silence, and fear, once useful, can begin to feed itself. Still, outside those walls, the people remembered the difference he had made. In Kaya, mothers spoke of sons who now returned home at night. In Dori, farmers brought grain to markets once empty. In Bobo Dioulasso, children studied under electric lights and called it the miracle of the fortress. They knew the cost, but they also knew the alternative. A teacher told a journalist, "We do not fear the fortress. We fear the world that made us need it." And perhaps she was right. For freedom is not a song sung once. It is a rhythm that must be kept alive. And sometimes the drummer must rest, lest the beat become a burden. Traoré understood this paradox. He spoke less now, listened more. He began to dream not of victory, but of endurance, a way for the fortress to become a foundation, not a prison. He told his cabinet, "We have built a fortress. Now we must build a future inside it." And outside, as dusk turned the sky to copper, the city breathed. The people moved, cautious but proud. Burkina Faso was no longer on its knees, but neither was it yet free to dance. The world called it stability. The people called it sacrifice. And history was still watching, waiting to decide which name would last. Because even the strongest fortress cannot stand forever, unless the fire inside still burns for freedom. The sun sets over the Sahel. The air is heavy with dust, yet golden, as if the earth itself is remembering. Burkina Faso stands quiet, wrapped in the stillness that comes not from defeat, but from endurance. The soldiers remain at their posts, but their eyes are softer now. The people walk with a measured calm, aware that the storm has passed, but the struggle never ends. And in the heart of Ouagadougou, behind guarded walls, a young man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, sits with history itself. He knows that walls can protect, but they can also imprison. He knows that vigilance is holy, but holiness without grace becomes law. And as he looks out upon his nation, he whispers what every true leader must one day admit. Freedom is not won, it is practiced. Because freedom is not a flag waving in the wind, it is a discipline, carved in courage, renewed in conscience, lived in unity. And so the story of Burkina Faso becomes more than Burkina Faso news. It becomes a mirror, showing every nation, every soul, that the price of sovereignty is not comfort, but commitment. Across the ocean, in churches and community halls of Atlanta, Detroit, and Harlem, elders of another struggle nod quietly. They recognize that rhythm, that heartbeat of resistance that once moved through Montgomery and Selma, now echoing through Ouagadougou and Bamako. The same song, in a different tongue. The same prayer, in a different desert. Because freedom speaks every language, it just asks the same question. Will you defend it when it stops being convenient? Captain Ibrahim Traoré is no saint, no savior, but he is a sign that the spirit of Africa still breathes, still builds, still believes. And that, perhaps, is enough. So if this story stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Share it, speak it, question it. Because history is not written by those who watch, it is written by those who engage. And if you believe, as I do, that freedom once awakened can never again sleep, then hit that subscribe button and walk with us into the next chapter.